Hello! Welcome to today's video, which is a mural painting process. This mural was commissioned for a fitness room inside a multifamily housing center called Solstice in Marana, Arizona. Everything is obviously under construction right now, but I still wanted to take this opportunity to share my journey from start to finish. Here's my husband and I. We're marking off the wall where I wanted to start blocking in the sky colors. Because I had just under 2 weeks to paint the wall, I aimed to maximize every hour I could. I wanted to project the mural to save time as opposed to drawing it, and I didn't want to waste all that sunlight. So instead of waiting for nightfall, we began blocking in the background sky colors. No projection is needed because I wanted it to be sloppy, chaotic, and have a bunch of movement for an interesting galaxy look. We used these really nifty splatter brushes to add all these splatter stars. This was way too much fun, frankly, and kept us occupied while we waited for the sun to go down. Sometimes I like to use projectors, sometimes I prefer to use a stencil, or depending on the circumstances, I'll just draw it on. But with something this complex, I decided it would be much easier to project it loosely for proportions and overall placement, especially with the time constraints. So, you'll see the images projected with the black lines on the wall from my digital drawing, and we just used carpenter pencils to transfer the image. It looks very crisp from far away, but the closer you get, you see that the line is actually quite blurry, and it's hard to tell what you're transferring up close. What was important to me at this point was keeping the proportions correct. Later, I ended up redrawing pretty much all of the Bobcats and anything with any amount of detail, so this was just to give me an idea of overall placement and the perimeter of shapes, such as the cats and the cactus. The next morning, I came back to take a look at the sketch. I started out using spray paint to reblock in some of the background shapes of color to better fit the projection and soften up transitions in the sky. My husband helped me block in the saguaros, and everything is very loose at this point, and that's how I want to work on a project like this. It gives me wiggle room to change elements as the artwork advances. Everyone has their own favorite supplies and setup, so I wanted to share mine with you. I like to paint on a large clipboard with palette paper. These are very affordable and it gives you plenty of room to mix. And also you have room for your reference photos or in my case, my iPad. You'll see a game plan of things that I want to fix or add. I also have room to mix the paint above. And as you'll see here, I put everything in crates and boxes as I had to carry all my supplies in and out of the job site each day. I brought a lot of different sized brushes, both large and small, just because I didn't know exactly what I was going to want to use. I also have a bunch of spray paint. I really like the Montana 94s and Iron Lac. Then for acrylic, I have to use the best Amsterdam acrylic. So thank you, Royal Talons, for sending me this paint. This stuff is my favorite, highly pigmented and light fast, goes really far, and just overall a wonderful paint to work with. So I love these larger jars because you can squirt it out and you can put the paint back in the jar if you don't use it. And I'll use a palette knife to mix large batches of color that I need to block in. That's why I love having a clipboard like this. You can mix all this paint and have the reference close by and be able to hold all of it with just one hand. So as you can tell, there's not a lot of detail in the mural at this point, and it's just because I like to begin with blocking in those large areas of color and slowly solidify where all the shapes and colors need to go. Then from there, I'm going to refine later on. This method is incredibly effective because it gradually shows how the colors are going to look next to each other. Especially when you're painting something so large, it's vital to take a step back and look at what you're doing, because if you're right in front of the wall, you're not going to be able to see exactly what's going on. Changing your perspective is a very important thing, so if you're ever painting anything large, definitely be sure to take multiple steps back and just see what it looks like from a distance. And as far as blocking in the color goes, if I'm blocking in something that has fur on it or it's very organic, I don't care if it's all a flat shade of that color. In fact, it's nice to have a little bit of variation as a base. So for these kind of more organic base coats, I use plenty of water, unless of course there's a bright color underneath that I need to cover up. Too much water may make that color too transparent. Blocking in may seem tedious, but allows for me to double check my positive and negative space, and it sets us up for those later layers. It's not something that's going to happen all at once, especially if it's a painting that's this large. This mural was 15 feet tall by 25 feet wide. So I knew I definitely needed scaffolding or something to help me get up to those higher heights, and I much prefer scaffolding than painting on just a ladder. I did anywhere between a 10 to 14-hour day broken up in two shifts, working until nightfall. There wasn't any electricity for lights or any type of AC, which was a major bummer because it was easily over 100 degrees all the days that I worked those weeks. The paint dried on my brush and the palette so quickly, and you'll see the sun reflecting off the wall in a couple parts of the video too. Finally, everything is blocked in. So now it's time to start making my second pass over this lower landscape area. And the reason that I did it first was because I do not enjoy painting landscapes. It's what I was the most worried about for this piece, so I just wanted to tackle it first. I used lots of dark colors for extra contrast in the foreground, and it looks out of place right now, but once I started putting the shadows on the Saguaros, I knew it was going to unify both of those much better. And I went with a very limited palette for this foreground area. Although it has quite a bit of color in it, or it appears to have a lot of color in it, it's actually just a few dark colors and a bright green and also some earth tones. I decided to experiment with perspective in this painting. Rather than having one uniform perspective, I wanted it to be more playful and have a heavy element of surrealism. Here I'm using a pencil to map out where I want the ribs of the saguaros. As I just mentioned, for the cacti, I want them to appear closer and some of them to appear farther away. The distance between the ribs will be the foundation of making that work. So once I had my lines mapped out, I'll follow behind with a small flat brush to block in the crevices of the ribs. I like to use a small brush to paint the line and then a larger brush to kind of feather the line down. That way it's not a thick, straight line all the way, we have a lot of variation, and it looks more organic. Here I'm mapping out the ocotillos using a paint marker. I love these acrylic markers, they're fantastic, especially for things like murals. If I was to use a pencil, it wouldn't show up as clearly, and I'm going to be painting over it with acrylic anyway, so I don't mind the white lines. This way, visually, I'll be able to stand back and see the line at a distance, so I can be confident in the shape before I paint. So I mapped out my ocotillos, and the other thing that I wanted to address was the sky. I wasn't super thrilled with how it was blending out over this bobcat, and I knew that I needed to fix it before painting the actual bobcats. So I did mask a couple things off, but overall the sky wasn't too hard to fix. Here I'm marking off the lower 6 inches of the mural. A few days into painting it, I considered that there may be baseboards, and I'm so glad I checked in with my contact because there are, and they're 6.5 inches tall. So I needed to compensate for that and just make sure to be able to push a couple of the elements up. Pivoting and being able to adapt your composition for circumstances like this are important. I didn't want to lose all my brown foreground because visually it would not be as interesting without it. And then here for the next couple clips, you'll see me fixing up the bobcats. I'm just redrawing their faces and bodies over top of the poorly projected faces. And after I redrew them, I ended up having to fix some of the galaxy around the cactus and the bobcats, so kind of just a little bit of a back and forth thing. But honestly, having a good sketch is so important because it's going to save me a lot of time and frustration while I'm painting, and I won't have to worry about proportions. I'll know that everything is accurate. So with the new baseboard adjustment, I wanted to rework and make a third pass on this lower area. I like to put everything I need in a milk crate so that I can scoot across the ground with them. I know it seems silly, but it's so incredibly helpful to have everything in one spot, and working with a limited palette really helps too. This way, I'll be able to, as efficiently as possible, paint this lower area and block it in. I was getting seriously creative trying to conserve as much energy as possible as I was sweating to death. I'm working with large brushes to block in the color and then switching down to the smaller brushes to add those smaller details into that foreground area. And now we are at my favorite part, where I got to paint the bobcats. I absolutely love cats, so this was a lot of fun for me. And I tried to pick a lot of different reference photos of multiple bobcats with different expressions and kind of combine them together. Within my limited palette for the mural, I used an even more limited selection of colors for the fur. That way, they'd look like they belong within the landscape and they'd also be very cohesive with each other. Even if my colors on my palette still didn't quite match my photo reference, I knew that they would look full and complete because of the planning that I did beforehand. Here's a look at my palette. Notice the warm versus cool and the contrasting colors. Extremely basic, but also quite effective. This palette helps me mix and plug in colors quickly because of my references all having different lighting. And as far as technique goes, I wanted their fur to be exaggerated and textured because I wanted that juxtaposition between the smooth saguaro and the starry sky. Keeping it very loose is much more expressive, and using the reference photo as more of a suggestion or guide rather than law works best for me. Especially because the majority of my cat references are compiled, so for a lot of the parts of the cat, I'm inventing the fur based off how it lays on other bobcats in other photos. And I knew I was going to come back through and have time to reassess every one of the bobcats, so I just wanted to get them roughly to the same point of completion. And then when I made my final pass, I was able to give everything a more harmonious look. It also gives you a break from looking at the reference and what you're painting. And then when you're able to come back to it on another day, you'll have fresh eyes and you'll be able to actually paint more effectively than if you just are really grinding on one area in particular. This bobcat was so charming for me to paint because it reminds me a lot of my cat at home named Bandit, and he does this thing on the scratching post where he like leans back. Anyway, I was just thinking of Bandit as I was painting all of the bobcats here. Because of the exaggerated push of perspective, this bobcat is so large and much closer up than the other ones, so in order to reinforce that perspective, it was going to need more detail than the others. So I ended up putting in more texture, a wider variety of small to large fur strokes, also more variety in the dots on the fur, and then smaller touches, but make them large. Things like whiskers and ear hair. And the mural's starting to be at the point where it's beginning to develop a little bit more and look like a cohesive painting because I've made at least one pass over every element in the painting here. So I'm laying down the foundation for the thorns. They're basically just little sloppy dots. And I'm only doing it again on some of the cactus that are supposedly closer up to help push that perspective further. Here I'm adding more dimension to the saguaros with highlights and shadows. I'm using that same deep blue from the landscape, a Prussian blue, combined with a glazing medium. Glazing medium is great for the darker colors because you can fully control the transparency easier on a larger scale, in my opinion. It goes on even, and the color beneath it blends beautifully, optically. But for all those bright highlights, I prefer to use the paint without a medium and then follow behind it with a large dry brush to diffuse the edges and kind of feather them to soften them up. This is a small step, but it made it so much more moody, and it started to have that nighttime look that I was going for. So now was finally time to get to the thing that I was avoiding, which is this large bobcat that's up here near the ceiling. It was very difficult for me to paint because not only was it the largest, but it was the highest up, and I ended up using three references alone of the bobcat's face and two for the paw and like multiple for the body. So it was kind of just a cluster of me going back and forth between reference photos. To expedite everything, I just moved my table up there and I was able to get in a little bit of a flow, but it was really hot up there next to the window, to the point that my phone couldn't even record time lapses. The next day, I got to move on to making the second pass on all the bobcats. And this is just important to make sure that they all look like they're the same species. I was feeling like some of my bobcats had too many spots, some were too warm, some were too cool, so it was just making sure that they all had their own expressions and personalities, but they all looked a little bit more cohesive. I also wanted to share with you my process for reevaluating what needs to be done. So the night before, I would take a picture of the bobcats in the state they were in, and I would put them next to the reference photo that I'm painting from. And I would either put guides or circles of things that I wanted to address. Then I'm able to look at both the reference and a picture of the painting both at the exact same size, at the same time, and it would help me assess what needs to be done. So sometimes I would actually do this process twice if I wasn't happy with how the bobcat looked, or sometimes I could just do it once and have it come out how I wanted it to. I actually have a whole video on how to paint large with acrylics, and one of my main tips is changing your perspective so that you can better evaluate what you're working on. Another thing that I thought was really interesting while I was working on this was small details like these saguaro flowers that were so high up. You really don't need to put that much detail into them because people aren't going to be able to see them as close as you are. However, it's important to paint them simply in a way that can be perceived neatly from down below. So, painting almost in a more graphic style is going to be more effective for something like this, even if close up it doesn't match the rest of your style. When we projected this, it was a little bit off of what I wanted, about 5 inches off to the left. And so I was feeling like this bottom right corner just needed something in it, and what would I rather paint than a cat, right? So I ended up painting an extra cat in there towards the end of the mural because I just felt like it needed a point of interest down low, especially because this is a wall that people are going to be next to all the time. It's kind of just a sweet little thing to see that cat down there on the ground level. I also thought that there was too much white negative space up top, and I kept going back and forth if I wanted to add more galaxy up top here, but I'm glad I did in the long run. The spray paint cans were literally so hot I could hardly hold them, so I had to pop them in the cooler for a little bit, just so that they could cool off to the point that I could hold them. Probably not the best, but it ended up working out okay. I also added some extra splatters, and this right here is the final day, and I'm just doing a lot of really small touch-up work. Things like the ocotillo that are in the foreground and very close up need a lot of detail to make it look like they're being pushed forward. So I ended up using paint markers for this just to give them a little bit of something extra. These paint markers are also very helpful for painting some extra stars that I wanted in specific places. My reference of the saguaro spines was a close-up photo, and I kind of just used it as an inspiration almost, because typically you can't see saguaro spines unless you're right next to them. But because I was emphasizing the perspective for that surreal look, I wanted to add them. I thought it was an interesting concept to consider these cute bobcats climbing over the sharp thorns with no problem. I used a mixture of white, gray, and raw umber to give them more of an earthy look, and I skewed them more on the white side if they were in the highlighted part of the saguaro, and I used more of the darker raw umber in the shadowed parts, just to make sure that the spines also kind of hinted that they were in or out of the shadow. For this last day of painting, I took lots of separate photos the night before of where the mural was at and compared it next to my reference photo. This way I was able to pinpoint anything that I needed to tweak. I stray from the reference more towards the end of the painting anyway, once I start to see things develop. These digital compositions are not going to be seen by anyone except for you guys right now, but really they just act more of a guide for me to work from. The finished artwork should be a derivative from the Photoshop Frankenstein mashup anyway. And I once heard that if you are overworking a piece of art, that the final brushstrokes that you add to your painting are typically just for you. And I feel like it was kind of at that point, honestly. And that's why it's so important to work from a plan or a digital composition or sketches, or you have to have some sort of outline to create a piece of art this large because there's so many opportunities to put extra detail and things into the painting that if you don't have a plan, you'll just never be able to stop, honestly. So, knowing when a piece of art is done, really for me, is just when I've crossed everything off the list that I wanted to do. And I'll give myself a little bit of time to tweak minor details and stuff to make sure that I'll be able to sleep at night. And if you create art, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So here's a look at the finished mural, and of course the room is not complete yet. They're gonna have painters come in and tape off the mural and paint the remaining walls that almond white color. And I requested that I was able to come in before the floor was installed and the other walls were painted and everything, just so that I could be as sloppy as I wanted to. I'm quite the messy artist. I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining me on this mural process artistic journey, and I really am so grateful for your support, so thank you. Of course, if you have any questions or comments, leave them below. I would love to hear from you, especially if you have any questions that are mural related. I'm doing another mural very soon, so let me know below and I can answer them in the next video for you. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful week.